This is going to be a video going over the VBCS workshop that I created. I know a lot of times people would often rather see how to do things by watching a video rather than going through a type of workshop like this. So that's why I'm recording the video. For those of you that like to see how things are made, this is going to be a lot more useful than actually going through and reading this document yourself. But the steps that we're going to take to make our application and the finished product are basically going to be the same thing, right? So before we begin actually creating the app itself, I want to go through what exactly it is that I'll be doing in this video. So in this video, I'm basically going to be walking you guys through how to create a fully functional web application using VBCS. And the website is going to look like this. You have a list of countries that this information is coming from an API, and basically on the click of a row, then you want to go, on the click of a row, then we'll display to the user information specifically for that country. It seems pretty simple, and I think it is pretty simple, but there's a lot of things that we have to go through in this guide. So specifically, I'm going to be going through over some of the features of VBCS, such as the drag and drop capabilities, how to set up REST APIs, how to configure your own action chains, and then kind of teach you guys how data flows within one page of VBCS to the other. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So I have my VBCS tenancy here, and so what I'll do is I'll actually create a new application, and I'll call this workshop. So this is going to be an empty application, and the way this works is basically in VBCS you have different projects, and then within those projects you have the actual applications yourself. So for this workshop, we're actually going to create a web application, not a mobile application. So we'll go here, create web application. Let's call this web app. Okay. And we can see that VBCS has created our first page for us, and this page is called main start. Now, I don't like the name main start, so I'm actually going to rename this to something that's more understandable. So I'll call this landing. You can call this index if you want, doesn't really matter. And this landing page is going to be the page for where all of our countries' information resides, right? Then what we'll need next is we'll need a second page for that specific country information for when they click on a certain row. So let's see. So we'll do another page. We'll call this country specific, or specific country. Okay. So now we have two pages. And what do we want to do next? So before we actually go through the front end of the first page here, what we'll do first is we'll configure how we pass data from a third party into our application. So to do that, we're going to be using REST APIs from this specific service. So this is a public URL that you can go to, a public endpoint for where you can get all of your information. So let's just test this here. Oh, so this endpoint gives you all the information for every country, right? And then that'll be one of the endpoints we use. And then the second endpoint will be this endpoint here. That will give you information for a specific country based on that country's name. So if I entered something like Afghanistan, this would come up. All right. So those are the two endpoints that we are going to be using. So how do we exactly configure those within VBCS? Well, to do so, anything REST related, we go into this tab here called Service Connections. And what you want to do is you want to add a service connection, define the connection by endpoint, and then enter the URL for your endpoint. So let's set up this endpoint here for all of the countries' information first. So we'll put that in here. This is going to be a get many. We'll do next. And instead of calling this service name REST v2, I'm going to call this country. So this again is a public endpoint that we're using, so we don't need anything like any username or password or any type of authentication here. So we can just leave this empty. But yeah, so we'll rename this to countries, and then before you actually create the connection, let's actually go ahead and test it out. So to test out the connection, all you do is click the send button here. And if you get a 200 status message, that's good. That's what you want. And you can see that this is the response. So what you want to do is you want to copy this response body. And what this does is this makes it so that in VBCS, basically, VBCS basically knows what type the response is going to be, right? It's going to be a list of objects where each object corresponds to a certain country. So we'll go ahead and copy that to the response body. And because this response is so long, actually, and there's so much information about all these countries, you'll get an error message here, or a warning message that says this payload is too long. So you can actually just ignore that. But okay, so let's go ahead and click create. It's all good to go. And then we also need another endpoint for the specific countries. So I'm going to put that here. And you can see that this is the base URL that we're using, but what we need is actually this entire URL, right? So we have this base part of the URL, so really all we need is just this second part here. So I'll copy that, add that here, and then instead of hard coding it, what we'll do is we'll add in these parameters here, like so, or just one parameter, I mean. And this is going to be the country name that we pass in. So again, before we click add the endpoint, all we really want to do is test this endpoint first. So what I'll do is, again, I'll just type in Afghanistan here, test it to see if we can get the 200 response. Okay, so we get the 200 response here. Again, we want to copy this response to the body, and then we'll click add. So with that being done, we pretty much have completed the REST API configuration for this web application. Additionally, we kind of set up the structure of how things would look, but we haven't exactly set up how things would look like yet, right? So, we created a new project, we created the REST API connection, so now what we want to do is we want to create the front end for this landing application. So typically, if you were to go about and create an application that looked like this, regularly what you would do is, in your index file or your HTML file, you would have to kind of split up this page into 4 sections here of equal sizes maybe, and then kind of, do a lot of the manual work that goes into creating a page like this. So splitting up the columns, then adding information, like 4 fields of information, the country code, the country name, the capital, things like that to each row, and it's a lot of work. But with VBCS, there is an element or a component called the table that we'll use to kind of organize our information a lot better than we would normally. So we'll add in the table component, and what we want to do is we want to bind data to that table. So the way that we go about doing that is clicking this add data thing here on the right. And what you want to do is you want to select the get all endpoint, because you want all countries' information to be displayed on this table. And then what we'll do is, since we successfully copied the response payload over earlier in our REST API configuration, VBCS knows what the response is going to be look like from this, from when it makes that GET request, right? So what exactly, do we need from this response? Well, we need these 4 fields here. We need country code, name, capital, and flag. So let's go ahead and do that. So country code is actually called alpha2 code. If you go back to here, you'll see that that's the field that we need. But okay, so we'll select alpha2 code, and then we need the country name. We need, what else do we need? We need the capital and the flag. So we have the capital, and then we have the flag as well. And then before we click next, what we want to do is we want to set up a primary key here. So let's just make that the alpha code, because every country has a unique alpha code, and we know that's not going to be repeated there. Okay, and click finish. We can ignore this page. All right, so a couple things here. The table looks kind of like what we want it to look like, but there is an error here, or not necessarily an error, but we have the country's URL here displaying instead of the actual image itself. So to kind of fix that, all we really need to do is drag this image component over onto this flag column like so. All right, and we'll see that the image here has popped up, but it's not necessarily grabbing, the actual flag image itself. And that's because when you go in here, when you add the image, you actually have to specify the source URL. So what we'll do is we'll actually just add this here, current.row.flag, which is basically saying, hey, since the payload earlier from that get all request was a list of objects, basically give me the current row flag attribute, and then we'll make that the source for this image here. So after doing that, we have the flags of each country. Okay, so we have the flags of each country, but again, they're pretty big for their size. So what you want to do is you actually want to change their width and height, and let's say we want to make it to 70. Let's do that. All right, okay. Looks like it works, so let's go ahead and test this out using this play button here. You can see that the flag is properly displayed, and it looks pretty good. So there is one thing here. It actually doesn't list all of the countries that we need, and that's because this table really only fetches the first 50 entries from that get API that we're using. So to fix that, we need to go into this table element here. Let's go down to data. Yeah, here we go. So the number of records fetched in the page designer is limited to 50. Use run mode to see full set of data. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll actually go into this all tab section here. And then here where it says scroll policy, instead of loading more on scroll, we just want to load everything. So let's do load all. Let's go back and test it out to see if it works. We should see all the countries' information. Okay, it looks like it worked. All right, so with that being done, there's a couple other things that we want to fix. Specifically, we want to fix this, this column here, or all of these columns actually, right? We don't want to display the actual field itself. So what we'll do is we'll just call this field country. What we want to do actually is we want to call this field country name, or country code, country name, capital, and then the flag. So to do that, again, we can go back to this table element here. Let's go down to general. Data. Let's go down to data, and here what says table columns, hit the edit icon, and we can see here that for each object there is, or for each column there is a field called header text and field. So header text is actually the text that's being displayed right here. So instead of displaying alpha 2 code, let's do country name or country code and see if it reflects. Yep, so it worked. So again, let's do the same thing for every other column. Let's call this name with a capital N, call this capital, call this flag. Okay, great. Then let's say we want to make this font bold, just like in here. So the way we go about doing that is we go into the data. Alright, so we'll go into the Alls tab. We'll go down to this section called columns. Click the arrow here. And you can see that right now we're editing the zero width column, right? This is zero based indexing. So we'll go down here, we'll go down to columns.header style, and what we'll do is we'll do font weight bold. Okay, and we'll copy this because we're going to do it for every column. Let's see if it worked. Yep, so it worked. Again, let's do it for the other column. So now we're on the 1th column. We'll do it here. On to the 2nd column. We'll do it here. Go into the 3rd column. We'll do the same thing. Okay. So it worked. Alternatively, if you didn't want to do that, what you could have done is you actually could have gone into the code section of the page itself and find all of the columns here. And you could have modified the CSS yourself by adding in this header style field right here, right? So you have the option of doing it yourself manually, kind of through the code section here, or you can do it through the UI. But either way, same result. So, okay, so that's pretty much how we make the first page. And now what we want to happen is we want, whenever a user, when they click on this certain row to be able to navigate to this specific country page and then, display information for that specific country, right? So there has to be some type of logic that we need to implement here. So how do we go about doing that? And how exactly do we implement that logic in VBCS? So the first thing really that we need to do is we need to go, we need to handle what happens when a user clicks a certain row. So in the events section of the table, we'll add an event called first selected row. And what this will do is it will create something called an action chain for us. And so what an action chain is basically how you handle all of your logic within VBCS. So so far what we've done is, we've created this first row and we've created this table, and whenever a user clicks on something, this action chain will happen. So we'll go ahead and edit this action chain directly, and what we want to happen is we want to navigate to another page, right? So specifically, we want to navigate to this specific country page. So we'll drag over a navigation component here, and we'll select the target for that navigation component. We'll make that be the peer page, and we'll select the specific country page. Okay. So a couple of things, that we need to handle next. When the user clicks on the row, now they will be navigated to this new page, right? But this new page actually doesn't have, it doesn't exactly have any kind of UI design yet. So what we need to do is we need to actually create the front end for this page, right? So to do that, let's go ahead and drag over this heading component. So this heading component is going to be the country's name. We'll put an image here for the country's flag, and then we'll put in 4 other fields for information specific to that country. Okay, so 2, 3, and 4. And specifically, we want the code, capital, region, and populations. So we can rename these labels to country code. So the country region. Country population. And capital. Okay, make that lowercase 2. All right, so we have kind of the basic layout of, how exactly we want things to look. Pretty basic, but what we need to handle next is how values get passed from one page to this page, right? And the way we do that is through the use of things called variables. So on this specific page, there's a couple of things that we need. We need a variable for the country's name. I'll just change this country name. We need a variable for the country code, the region, population, capital, and the image URL as well. So we need a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variables that we need to create. So to create those variables, let's go into this variable and types tab here. We'll click plus variable. And let's call this one country name. So this is going to be a string. Let's call this country flag. Again, this is going to be string, country code, string, country region, again a string, country population. This here is going to be a number. Let's see, so 245, and what else are we missing? Capital. And again, this is going to be another string. Okay. So, all right, so now what we need to do is we need to bind these variables to those input fields. And the way we go about doing that, I'll show in a little bit as soon as this loads up. So we go back to our page here, and what we'll do is we'll click on this input text here, and we'll go to the data section. And it's really simple. All we need to do is bind this country code field to the country code variable. We'll do the same for the region, country region, country population, and the country capital. And same thing for this header here. Instead of having hard-coded text, we'll just change this value to the country name. And then this image here, we'll change it to the country flag. Okay, so we successfully binded the inputs, the input boxes, contents to the variables, but we're not actually passing the value from that landing page to the specific country page yet, right? So we need some logic to figure that out, and then that'll pretty much be it, and we'll be done. So how do we go about doing that? So basically what we want to happen is whenever the user clicks on a row in our landing page, they will be navigated to this page. And then as soon as this page enters, what we want to do is we want to make another GET request to that specific country endpoint that we made earlier, right? But if you notice, that specific country endpoint needs a parameter. It needs the country's name, right? So that means that we have to pass over this country's name from that previous page to that new page. So the way we do that is we'll go into our specific country page, we'll go into our variables, and this is the field that we want to pass in, right? So to pass in this field from another page, all we really need to do is click this enable button. And you'll see that the icon here has changed a little. You'll see a little arrow here. And what this means is that this page is expecting a variable to be passed from another page, right? So if we go back to our landing tab here, we go into the action chains that we made earlier. Into actions. This navigation field now will actually expect a parameter to be passed in. And that parameter that we're going to be passing in is the country name, right? So let's click this. So let's assign that parameter here. So this action chain is right now, you have access to the rows data, right? Because when we set it up, we made an event so that when a table row is clicked, we can have that table row's information here, and we'll pass that into the action chain, if that makes sense. So what we'll do is we'll drag the row data component and we'll map it over to our country name parameter here. And instead of passing the entire row, all we really need is the name attribute for that specific country that we clicked on. So, let's do .name here, and we'll click save. And so what happens now is that on a click of a row, this action chain is going to be triggered, and in this action chain we're going to navigate to another page, and we're going to pass information to that other page, specifically the country's name that was clicked, right? So now when we go back to our specific country page, we now have access to that country's name, and then it should display on the header here. So let's go ahead and test that out. So I'm clicking on a specific row, and nice. Okay, so Afghanistan got passed in. So to be safe, we'll test it with another example here. Let's do Argentina. That was also passing correctly, right? So we passed in the name correctly, but now we need to get the flag and all of these other fields as well. So how do we do that? Well, what we need to do is, since we have this name field passed in, what we can do is, once this page loads up, we can make another GET request to that specific country API that we made, and then map the response of that request to our variables, which will populate these fields, right? So, okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So what we need to do is we need to basically trigger a REST call once this page is loaded. So to do that, we'll go to the events section here, and we'll add a new event listener to this specific country page. And the specific listener that we need is something called VBEnter, right? So something is going to happen as soon as as soon as we enter that page. And what exactly is going to happen? Well, again, we need another action chain to define the logic that we're going to be creating. So we'll call this call specific country API. Click select, and again we're going to define the logic that goes in the chain, right? So if we click this chain here, what we really need to do is we need to create a REST API once this page is loaded. So let's drag over the REST endpoint component over here, and we'll select the endpoint that we made earlier called name country name, and we need to give this endpoint a country's name, right? So since we have that saved in a variable, we can just map over the country name variable that we passed in earlier from the last page to this parameter that we're going to be using in this API call, right? And then on the successful call of this, this REST API, if we get a 200, what we'll do is we will assign variables, right? So we'll click assign variables here, and then the results of that, the response of that REST call will assign to some of our variables that we've created here, right? So alpha2 code, if you guys were paying attention earlier, maps to the country code field here. We have capital that we need. We'll map that like so. We need flag. We need country name, population, region. Save. Okay, and that should be it. So essentially what we're going to do is, again, once this page loads up, we're going to make a REST call. We're going to pass into that REST call a country's name, and then if that REST call is successful, we assign our page variables to the results of that, so we assign it to the response of this REST call. So that should work, and let's go ahead and test this out. All right, so we're on our landing page, and if we click on a certain row, sweet. So the page is successfully, we successfully passed in information from one page to the next. And obviously there are some formatting issues. If you wanted to add some padding using CSS and things like that, you can do so yourself. But as far as functionality goes, that's pretty much where we'll stop at this workshop. Maybe one other thing, we don't want the user to modify any of these fields since we're just displaying information and not accepting any type of input. So to do that, we'll just go here and we'll make this field read-only. We'll do that for all fields. Okay, and if we test it out again, Right. So no more input box. And then in terms of padding, you know, we have our image here. If you guys wanted to do any type of padding or change the size of the image, you can do so here. I'll go down to general attributes, and then there's a style section. We'll do padding bottom. Let's do like 40 pixels, right? Yeah, so padding took effect. You can do the same thing up here and kind of style it in whatever way you want. But yeah, so that is pretty much kind of the basics of VBCS. I know it's a really simple workshop, but I think a lot of the logic that you would use for, creating more complicated apps and, things like that is, definitely very relevant. So a couple of things that we covered. We covered how to do the drag and drop UI design for VBCS. You guys learned how to configure your REST APIs in VBCS. One that was, pretty much a static URL, and then one where you actually had to pass in a parameter. We configured, action chains, how to handle logic within VBCS using action chains, and then, again, data flow within VBCS, right? So using things like variables and event listeners and action chains in conjunction with one another to achieve a certain result that you guys need. So yeah, that is pretty much the entire workshop. I hope this is helpful for you guys. And I will be uploading this to Orodoc so that all of you guys have access to this as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, thanks guys.